All right, so now that we looked at some of the instruments that can affect diluted earnings per share, we're going to revisit earnings per share and talk about a secondary measure of earnings per share. Now, earnings per share is a measure of extreme importance in the financial world. It's incorporated into the bonus plans of a lot of executives, a lot of compensation. Uh, Employee compensation plans can depend on EPS metrics. It is the denominator in the price to earnings ratio. And the price to earnings ratio is a good use to examine potential growth opportunities. High price to earnings ratios um, typically mean that we have a growth firm. The idea is that price tends to lead earnings because prices are thought to be a more sophisticated measure of value than are the book earnings of a company. And also accounting earnings are thought to be rather conservative in general. So we aren't necessarily going to show growth as much as the market might. Anyway, so that's one use of them. And also, analysts focus on operating income as opposed to net income, but that doesn't mean that they ignore bottom line EPS. Typically, analysts will forecast an EPS, and it is the manager's job. I mean, it's not officially, obviously, their job, but it almost has become the manager's job to meet those expectations come hell or high water, so that the firm can show that it is growing within forecasted measures based on financial analysts' valuation. EPS is just going to be a measure for the amount of net income that is available to common holders. Obviously, it's not always going to be available simply because it may have to be used to pay off certain bond promises or things, but in essence or in theory it is available after we strip out all of the payments that are made, and it is basically an accounting counterpart to the stock price of a company. So it's a pretty important measure that we're looking at here. IFRS allows adjusted basic and diluted EPS based on alternative earnings measures. GAAP currently does not, so that's something to think about when you're determining the difference between these two systems. Allowing the adjusted measures is kind of an interesting thing because it allows what we call under US GAAP pro forma earnings, which are earnings outside of GAAP. It's some people have called it everything but the bad stuff earnings, but essentially it's an earnings that figure that can become that is derived by management that attempts to portray a more accurate version of what future earnings are supposed to be. So anyway, a big difference between the two systems. So most companies are going to be required to disclose two EPS measures, the basic EPS measure, which you know and love, and then a diluted EPS measure, which you don't know, but you'll come to love. The basic EPS is going to ignore these convertible instruments that we just spoke about. So options, bonds, warrants, preferred stock. Those items are not weighted in our basic EPS. It shows you the earnings available for each common holder. This is the one we've seen before, net income less preferred stock dividends divided by weighted average common shares outstanding. That's what that stands for. We're also going to develop a couple of methods to determine weighted average common shares outstanding so that you can learn to formulate that on your own. Diluted EPS takes into account the hypothetical events of what would happen if all of our convertibles were exchanged for common stock. So what that would tend to do, if you just think of it perhaps initially, you just say, wow, the denominator is going to blow up. But remember, there's also a numerator effect for a lot of those convertible securities. Like once debt is converted, we no longer have interest expense. Once preferred stock is converted, we no longer have preferred stock dividends, right? So what our goal is to incorporate all those bad effects until we have a maximum dilution that could occur. And this is all in the land of make-believe, all something that we're coming up we're just trying to give the investors the worst case scenario of what could happen. So let's look at how this could be important. So we have two firms. Company A has net income of $1 million, common shares of $1 million. Company B has the same million, but then they got some stock options, right? So if we look at the basic EPS for both companies, Company A would have a basic EPS of 1 million divided by 1 million shares. $1 million divided by 1 million shares. And that would be the same for Company B. $1 million divided by 1 million shares, which would seem to indicate that both have an EPS, a basic EPS of $1 per share. But if we look at the diluted EPS, that's BEEPS, basic EPS. If we look at the DEEPS, the depths of the company, the DEPS, then for Company A, yeah, it's still just $1 million over 1 million shares, which equals $1 per share. But for Company B now, we get a different outlook of the company because we say, well, you have $1 million in earnings, but you also have 1 million stock options that could be exercised. So if we consider all those exercised, now we're only going to have 50 cents per share of EPS. Or I'm sorry, not EPS. Now we're in depths, deeps, right? Okay. So there's a pretty simplified example, but it illustrates a point. You got to be aware of what could happen when you have these instruments that could potentially take the form of common stock at any point in time. So one of the first things we're going to look at is how to calculate appropriately a weighted average share outstanding. It's more than just taking the simple average of shares at the beginning of the year and shares at the end of the year, dividing them by 2. That's not going to work. So what we're looking at is a per month schedule, right? So for January 1st, they had 10,000 shares of common stock outstanding. They issued 5,000 more on April, repurchased 1,200 shares November 1st. For the year ended December 31st, they reported net income of 100,000 and paid preferred dividends of 35. So in order to determine the common shares outstanding, there's really two methods that you can incorporate. One is called a change method. One is called the cumulative value. So the change method would suggest that on 1/1/10, we started with 10,000 shares of common stock, and this amount was outstanding for all 12 months, right? 12 of 12. And so when we weight that by the change, then we would get 10,000 shares. Now on 4/1, they issued 5,000 more shares. So the change in my outstanding is going to be 5,000. Because I only issued 5,000, I'm only interested in the change. Now this change has been outstanding since April, so that means that it should receive a weighting of 9 of 12 months because 9 months now had an additional 5,000 shares. So you adjust it by those terms and you get 3,750. Finally, we repurchased 1,200 shares, so this is actually a negative change in the amount of common shares outstanding. So that negative 1,200 was outstanding for only 2 of 12 months. And so we would want to weight that proportionately so that it doesn't receive too much weight. So that would be 200 when we weight it. Okay. Now for the totals, well, we had 10,000 to start off with. We increased that by 5,000. We decreased that by 1,200. So that means that we have 13,800 in total, right? Because remember, those are change amounts. Went up to 15, went down by 1.2 to 13.8. Weighted average of these guys here is going, I'm sorry, the total of these guys here is just going to be summing up their weighted averages, which in this case would give me 13,550. So very different than just taking a simple average, different than obviously the total shares outstanding. But then there's another way you can think of it. If the changes don't really make much sense to you, you could think about how how long they had each amount outstanding for. So first they had 10,000 outstanding. Then on April 1st, they issued 5,000 more. So they had 15,000 outstanding. And then on April 1st, they bought back. So they have 13,800. So they would have 13,800 at the end. Now, how long did they have 10,000 shares outstanding for? They had 10,000 shares outstanding for January, February, and March, so only 3 of 12 months. Then they had the additional 5,000 to make 15,000 for April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November. That's 8 months. Oops, wait, no. April, May, June, July, August, September, October. Sorry, 7 months. Count on your fingers. 7 months, and then the final one was only outstanding for 12 months, and then you weight each of those, 10,000 times 3 divided by 12, 2,500, 15,000 times 7 divided by 12, 8,750, and 13,800 times 2 divided by 12, 2,300. And then add those guys together. $13,550. So either way, you get the same number. I don't care which method you use. Just use the one that makes more sense to you. Hopefully one of them does make sense to you. Now to calculate the new basic EPS, the BEEPS, we would have net income of $100,000 minus the preferred dividends of $35,000 divided by 13,550, weighted average shares outstanding. So 100 minus 35 divided by 13.55 is giving me 479.7, so approximately $4.80 of earnings per share. Okay. So stock splits and stock dividends are a little different. The reason why we want to treat them a little differently is that if we had an earnings per share based on a pre-stock split, right, a pre-2-for-1, then a post-2-for-1, right? The post-2-for-1 is going to be half of it, right? Because we double the shares outstanding, therefore we're going to divide them by 2. And so you don't want this drastic decrease in your EPS from something as simple as issuing new shares. We don't want management to have issuing new shares based on a dividend or a stock split, because technically what we're doing, we're not increasing wealth. We wouldn't be increasing the amount of dilution because everyone receives a proportionate share more. So we don't weight these. We don't weight them, which means that even if they occur on December 31st, anytime during the year, we still treat it like it was January 1st. Okay. So everything that's prior to the split has to be modified so it's in post-split terms. Anything after the split is already in post-split terms. So looking at the same thing, except now, rather than have just the issue and the repurchase, right? The issue of 5,000, the repurchase of 1,200, like we had in the prior example, we have a 2-for-1 stock split on June 1st. So everything prior to June 1st is going to have to be doubled. It was 10,000 shares of common stock, but post-split terms, those would represent 20,000 shares of common stock. We had issued 5,000, but in post-split terms, those became 10,000. Now, the 1,200 we repurchased, that's already post-split terms now. We don't have to double that. And then the same procedure is applied in terms of weighting them. Well, 20,000 was a case for 12 of 12 months. We then had issued an additional 10,000. That was the case for 9 of 12 months. And then the reduction by 1,200 was only enacted for 2 months. And then so you can go through and weight them and redetermine what your weighted average shares would be. So the weighted average then would be 27,300 when the true amount outstanding would have been 28,800. Then you can do the alternate way where you had 20,000 because we have to adjust for the split. You issue an additional 5, which is 10,000 post split. So now you have 30. And then finally, the very final one is already post split. No need to adjust it again. It'll be at 28,800. That has been the case for 2 months. This was the case for 3 months. This is the case for 7 months. And then weight them. So it's 28.8 almost. Didn't do that myself. 40.8. Which again gives you 27,300 shares. And then you calculate the basic EPS once again. The beeps is going to be your net income minus your preferred dividends of $35,000 and divided by your shares outstanding. Right. So let's talk about how diluted EPS works. Now we have weighted average shares outstanding down. Let's look at what we're doing in the land of make-believe. Remember, we want to produce the lowest EPS figure possible because we want to show maximum dilution. Why do we want to show this? Because we want the investors to be aware of what could happen if all of the convertible security or option holding, warrant holding investors decided to cash in their convertible option or their exercisable option. So what we do in order to calculate diluted EPS is to first calculate basic EPS. Then we identify all the dilutive securities. We're going to calculate a dilution index for each one. We're going to rank them by their dilution indices, and we're going to include the effect of each one incrementally by their lowest dilution index to the largest dilution index. When the index for the next type of security is larger than the last diluted EPS figure, stop. So if the dilution index is greater than your last deeps, that means stop. Because essentially what the dilution index shows is an incremental effect of how much it's going to dilute your EPS. So if this is 2 and this is 1.5, it's not going to dilute it at all. In fact, it's going to be something called anti-dilutive. It's going to make, if you include that security with a dilution index of 2 into a DEPS that is already at 1.5, it's going to increase the DEPS from 1.5 to a higher number. Now, if your dilution index was 1.2 and your DEPS is 1.5, then you include it because it will bring the 1.5 down further. Remember, we're trying to get the lowest DEPS figure we can. So how to calculate a dilution index? Essentially, a dilution index is just a numerator effect is equal to the numerator effect divided by the denominator effect. of that particular security. And so we want to look through and then say, well, what is the numerator effect of all these? What is the denominator effect of all these? A convertible preferred security, right? If we convert preferred stock, we are going to have less subtracted from the numerator. So it's going to have an increase on my numerator and an increase in my denominator. So it's going to increase the numerator overall. And because once these preferred stocks convert, there's going to be new outstanding common stock, we're going to have a larger denominator. Convertible bonds, once they're converted, we don't have interest expense anymore. But that reduction in the expense triggers additional income tax on that expense we just saved. And so really what we save is the after-tax interest expense. This too will increase the numerator, and once they convert, it will also increase the denominator. And so whether or not these are going to be dilutive or antidilutive is going to depend on what the relationship between the numerator effect and the denominator effect is. If we're saving on billions of dollars of dividends and each preferred share is only convertible into one common share, it's likely it's going to be anti-dilutive because it'll have an extreme increase in the numerator, not so much of a denominator, right? Could be the opposite situation. Very little dividends, each preferred share convertible into 1,000 common shares, something ridiculous, right? Options and warrants, when they're exercised, they have no effect on net income. And their denominator effect is going to be based on something called the treasury method. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So they have no effect on net income, which means that their dilution index will always be zero. Because it's a numerator effect and a denominator effect, well, they're always going to have a denominator effect of some sort. But if they're numerator, they don't have an effect on net income when exercised. Therefore, their dilution index is zero. So a lot of times we assume, or in a lot of problems, we'll assume that these things are outstanding for the entire year. But it may be the case that the convertible bonds were issued in October. And if they are issued in October, then the interest expense would only affect it for the final quarter of that year. And they could only be convertible into shares of outstanding common stock for that final quarter of the year. And so if this is the case, then we're going to want to weight their effects in the numerator and denominator effects so that we appropriately mimic real life to the point where we're not assuming we can convert bonds as of January 1st that weren't even issued until October. Also, if a bond is not issued at its face value, right, if we have a carrying value that is different, then we're going to have a premium or a discount, and the amount of interest is going to be based on the carrying value of the bonds at the beginning of that year times the market rate at which they've been issued. So there's a few little complicating effects that you should be able to handle just based on methods you've employed before or actual topics we've talked about before. For options and warrants, we have what I refer to as the treasury stock method. Now, the treasury stock method is going to be an attempt to estimate the number of new shares that would be required if the options are exercised. So the idea is that when we exercise, we receive cash. Because of that cash inflow to the firm, the idea is that we're going to assume the firm uses exercise proceeds in order to value, not wanting to focus. We are going to have to assume assume that the firm uses the exercise proceeds to repurchase shares of stock for the option exercise. So, for example, 10,000 people might exercise their stock options, but we're not going to necessarily have to issue 10,000 new shares. What we assume we do with the exercise proceeds is use those to repurchase as many shares as we can and give those to the people that have exercised their options so that we don't have to issue brand new 10,000 shares. Okay. So let's look at the beginning of this example, and then I think you'll be able to handle the follow through. But we have diluted EPS number one. Aquakeel has the following potentially diluted securities outstanding throughout the year. 5,000 shares of $6 convertible common stock, each convertible into 2 shares. 1 million face value, 6% convertible bonds issued at 100 each. So that means that they were issued at face value. Makes their calculation a little more simple. Each are going to be convertible into 25 shares of stock. And then we have warrants for 20,000 common shares. The warrants have an exercise price of 30, and the average share price during the year was 40. Okay. They have reported net income of 250, had 100,000 weighted average common shares outstanding. The tax rate is 40. So now we're going to calculate beeps and deeps. So my basic EPS is going to be the $250,000 minus any preferred dividends. We have 5,000 shares of $6 convertible preferred stock. That gives me a $30,000 dividend. 6 would just be the percent times the par value. So that is $30,000 preferred stock dividend, and we have 100,000 shares weighted average outstanding. So then we simply get $2.20 per share. That's my basic EPS. That's the first step. Now, prior to that, of course, we would have had to determine weighted average shares outstanding if I hadn't given them to you, but in this case, I gave them to you. So now we want to rank our diluted securities, or identify and then rank them. We have preferred stock. We have convertible bonds. And then we have warrants. So their numerator effects, the preferred stock has a $30,000 numerator effect because of its dividends. The denominator effect is going to be the number of new shares. So each is convertible into 2 common shares. We have a 10,000 denominator effect. And then when we solve for the dilution index, remember it's just a ratio of the numerator to the denominator effect. We have a dilution index of 3. The convertible bonds have a face value of $1 million, issued at 100. So that means that the carrying value is going to be $1 million throughout. So then that means that each one of them would have had 6% interest expense. 6% of $1 million is 60,000. So that's the amount of interest expense we would save. However, because now we get $60,000 of additional net income, we have to multiply that by an after-tax rate to get the post-tax income. So we actually are only saving $36,000 because we're giving up a tax shield of $24,000. Now, each $1,000 bond is convertible into 25 common shares. If there's 1,000 bonds here, then that means that we have 25,000 new shares that could be converted. And so now the dilution index, again, is just going to be that 36 divided by the 25. And finally, we have these warrants. When warrants are exercised, there's no net income that is recognized. So there's no numerator effect, and there's no numerator effect for options or warrants. Like I said, their dilution index is going to be 0. Now, their denominator effect is going to be found by the treasury stock method. Remember, so each of these is going to be exercisable for $30. If there's 20,000 of these, then that means that we are going to bring in $600,000. Oops, put my comma a little too soon there. So $600,000 of proceeds from the exercise. Now, we assume they're going to take those and invest money so that they don't have to issue 20,000 new common shares. So they're going to take that $600,000, and then we're going to figure out how many shares they can buy if the average price was $40 per share. So they can buy 15,000 shares with proceeds from the exercise of the warrant issue. If they can buy that many shares back, then they only have to issue 5,000 because they would have had to give them 20,000. They're going to buy back 15, so the denominator will only have an effect of 5,000. So now we figured out their dilutive indexes. We now rank them. We're going to include that first, that second, and that third, right? So with warrants, we're calculating my DEEPS 1, which is going to be all the usual suspects in the formulation of basic EPS, but now we add 5K to the denominator. So now it's 220 divided by 105, which gives me a DEEPS of 209.5, so it's basically 210 EPS. Now, we then want to incorporate our next most dilutive security, number 2, as long as it is lower than my DEEPS, because if this is lower, it's going to bring my DEEPS down more. Well, it is, so I can go ahead and consider it. DEEPS 2 is going to incorporate everything that DEEPS 1 had, 250K minus 30K, 100K plus 5K. So it includes the dilutive influence of those warrants and then adds on to it. Well, we have an additional dilutive effect of 25,000 shares, and we increase my numerator by $36,000. So now I have a numerator of 256, and I have a denominator that is equal to 130,000. So that's 196. That's my second DEEPS. Now I would incorporate my third if it was below 196, but it is not. So it would actually be anti-dilutive. The reason why it's anti-dilutive is that those $30,000 more of numerator outweighs the effect of adding 10,000 to my denominator, so it actually would boost this. You could try it and see, right? So I would stop here just to not waste any time. But the worst thing that could happen is you realize you screwed up, right? Because now this would increase my numerator to 286. This would increase my denominator to 140. 286 divided by 140 equals $2.04, right? We don't want that because we wanted the worst case scenario, right? So that's DPS, DEPS, DEEPS and DEEPS. It's not really the hardest stuff in the world. People tend to get it wrong on the test. Don't ask me why. But it's a very formulaic process. As long as you know what you're doing, it's really easy to lay it out every time and compute a correct response. Okay. So thank you very much, and we will talk soon.